Hello there, I'm Mary Myatt, and I'm delighted to share some thoughts with you on getting back on track and the development of an ambitious curriculum. So, there are three elements I'm going to be sharing on this session. The first is making the case for cutting back. The second is taking a look at some of the best bets from the field of psychology and the field of cognitive science that can help us to refine our practice to help children learn more and know more and remember more over time. And then a few thoughts on what we might cut back on in order to be able to do deeper work on the curriculum. So, in terms of making the case for cutting back, I'm drawing on a number of thinkers. And here I'm drawing on Greg McKeown's work on the disciplined pursuit of less. That we need to be doing fewer things in greater depth, because if everything is a priority, then nothing is truly a priority. So, Greg McKeown is well known for his work on essentialism, and he provides some really useful insights into helping us to focus and keep the main thing the main thing. The second person I'm calling on to make the case for fewer things in greater depth is Pareto and the 80-20 rule. So Pareto was a professor of sociology at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland, and he was doing work in the late 1890s. And his research was on land ownership in Italy. And what he found was that 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the population. And he speculated at the time whether those proportions might apply in other countries and in other contexts as well. And it turned out that it was remarkably consistent. But since Pareto's time, leadership consultants and thinkers have found that across all sorts of sectors, whether they're public sector or private sector, that the 80-20 rule is remarkably consistent. And what that means is that it's a relatively small amount of input that produces the greatest output or impact. Now, it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's just thinking that there are some things that are going to make a difference and going to produce, in our case, greater and better outcomes for our pupils and students than others. So looking at the work we do around the curriculum and other aspects of school life, it's quite useful to think about the 80-20 rule. Is this really going to have the impact that we hope it does? Then the final person I'm calling on to make my case for fewer things in greater depth and getting back on track is Marie Kondo's work. She's very well known for the process of decluttering. And I think although her work is related to the home and personal life, I think that some of the insights that she provides can also apply to our work as professionals as well. So we might ask ourselves, the question that she asks is, does this spark joy? And as I look at my own resources and that I'm working with and I'm sharing with colleagues, do they spark joy? In the sense that, are they fit for purpose? Are they well designed? And are they as fresh as they can be? And so when I do that work and go through my materials, I discard those ones that are not really fit for purpose. So I think taking an approach along the lines of Kondo to some of the resources we have for children, some of our ways of practice can be helpful alongside Pareto and McKeown. And then what follows from this is that we've just got to stop trying to do everything. And I think this is an issue in the sector because we tend to want to be able to do everything because we're committed to working with our pupils and students, but it's just not realistic. And so we've just got to pause and say, is this really adding value? to children's learning. And if it's not, then we need to stop. Now, that's not to say that it's easy to do this, and there will be trade-offs. So we might get some pushback because things have always been done in this way. But the point is that we simply cannot have over-cluttered professional lives. We've got to focus on the things that are making the greatest difference to pupils' learning. So one of the ways to go about this is to approach it with a spirit of careful curiosity. So it's not that we chuck out everything willy-nilly. It's about being curious about whether this is really fit for purpose, and having those conversations with colleagues as well. And underpinning this, it's helpful to consider the whole time, what is it that adds the greatest value, and to focus on those rather than trying to do absolutely everything. So if we apply this now to just some elements of the quality of education judgment, one of the things that's a big thread within the quality of education judgment is the extent to which the curriculum for all our pupils is truly ambitious. So we can turn to what it is that pupils are saying about provision in schools. I've got an example from secondary and one from primary. So I was doing a piece of work in a school in London a while ago before lockdown, and I was asked by the school to talk to some students that they'd identified as being high prior attaining but underachieving, able but idle. And so I sat down and I spoke to these students. They were year nines. There were about 6 of them, and they happened to be all boys. And I said, is there any subject in this school where you're not messing around? Because they weren't learning, but they were also stopping others from learning. And they said, well, we don't mess around in geography. And I said, well, why not? And they said, well, our teacher just gives us really interesting, difficult stuff to do that really makes us think. And so, for example, for homework, she'll give us proper geographical publications to read and then to talk about at the start of the next lesson. And they said, what our teacher says is, don't worry if you can't understand all this, because at the start of the next lesson, we're going to have a discussion about it. So it meant that they were able to enter into this ambitious work, and it didn't matter if they didn't get it all, because their teacher was going to explain it to them, the parts that they didn't understand in the next lesson. Now, when I checked the results for geography in that school, in a very high performing school, they were the highest by a margin, and similarly nationally. Now, the teacher didn't give them that rich, difficult, demanding work in order to get great results. The great results follow from children being given that difficult, demanding work. And I was in that teacher's classroom later that day, and she had the same high expectations for all the students, regardless of their starting points, some with quite low starting points. So if we're thinking about the 80-20 rule, thinking about ambition, which is in the quality of education judgment, we're likely to get greater outcomes, whether it's in primary or secondary, if we pitch our work with sufficient challenge for all our pupils. So that's one example of the 80-20 rule. A second example from primary is from Alison Peacock's book of 2015, Assessment for Learning Without Limits. And in this book, Alison and a colleague interviewed some pupils as they were going from year 5 into year 6. And what they wanted to find out was what children thought of ability groups and ability tables. But actually, the children are talking about the level of work that they're getting. So this is what they had to say, that they wanted more demanding work, and this is what they had to say. The first day the children were back, we asked them what they thought of ability groups, and the answers were astounding. The more able loved it, and they enjoyed being the bright ones and having special challenges set by the teacher. The middle group were annoyed they didn't get the same work and challenges as the other group. They wanted to try harder work, but they'd worked out they'd never be moved up, as there were only 6 seats on the top table. The less able were affected the most. They felt dumb, useless. They thought they'd never be allowed challenges, as they usually work with a teaching assistant. And this less able group liked the sound of some of the challenges that the top group had, but they knew they would never get the chance. So if we're thinking about an ambitious curriculum for all our pupils and students, and we're thinking about it in terms of getting back on track and fewer things in greater depth, and rather than lots of differentiated worksheets, providing children with rich material, we know creates greater outcomes, better outcomes for all pupils, but regardless of their starting points. However, we don't just leave them to flounder. The principles of this are high challenge. So like the geography example, like the example we've just heard from primary, they want difficult, demanding work, but it must be accompanied by low threat. We don't leave children floundering, we help them to get into the work. And we scaffold it primarily through talk, which is one of the most efficient ways of doing it. So we might want to ask ourselves whether we're deepening our pupils and students' learning through appropriate levels of challenge. And are we working to the principles of learning without limits, which is Alison Peacock's and her colleagues' work. So then thinking about ambition in terms of the individual subjects that we teach, there can be a tendency to tie everything into tests and examination results. So we're teaching this subject because we want children to do well in their SATs, or we're teaching this subject in secondary because we want them to do well in their GCSEs or BTECs. Those are important. The SATs and the public examinations are important. But if we're thinking about a truly ambitious curriculum for all our pupils and students, we need to go beyond that conversation to a wider space and actually say, well, why are we teaching this subject? Because the curriculum is bigger than the tests and the examinations. So just some prompts for this to take it a bit further. Is it truly ambitious, the way we talk about the curriculum? What's the big picture for the individual subjects that we're teaching, whether we're in primary or in secondary? What's at the heart of this subject? What's magical about it? And why is it important? So what would our children be missing out on if they came into our school and they weren't taught any design technology or history or geography or whatever? When we start having those conversations, we can take our professional dialogue and thinking about curriculum provision to a much more expansive, a much more imaginative place. So I've got some quotes here that colleagues have found helpful to prompt these discussions so that we get to a truly rich provision for all our pupils. I've just pulled up a few. So this is one from Art and Design from Don Miguel Reith. Every human is an artist. So if I'm teaching art and design, whether in primary or secondary, do I agree with that quote? Now, we don't have to agree with it, but if we don't agree with it, then why do we think that art and design is important? When we talk in this way, it means that we're open to much more interesting resources and ideas than if we just think of everything as being at its lowest common denominator. You know, it's on the national curriculum. Children need to be taught the national curriculum. Yeah, but what about the beauty of the individual subjects? One from history, Marcus Garvey: a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. So again, we don't need to agree with this quote, but it serves as a prompt to help us to articulate why history is important. A lovely one from Languages, a Czech proverb: you live a new life for every language you speak. If you only know one language, you only live once. So with this recording, there are the quotes for all the national curriculum subjects, if they're helpful for discussions within your context. So I'm going to turn now to some of the headlines from research that can help us to do fewer things in greater depth, help us to get back on track, and help us to provide a curriculum and deliver a curriculum that is going to help our children to know more and to remember more and able to do more over time. So the research comes from the fields of psychology and cognitive science, and a couple of things to say about them by way of introduction. The first is that it's never hard and fast. We might take the line that Dylan William takes, that we regard these as best bets from the findings from the research. So that means we consider some of the headlines, and then if it seems to make sense for our pupils in our context, then we go ahead and trial them. But there's no three-line whip. If we don't think they're relevant or they're going to make a difference, we don't use them. The second thing to say about the findings from the cognitive science and psychology is an awful lot of the findings are common sense. So we might ask ourselves, did we really need the science to tell us some of this stuff? And the fact is, we don't. We know it in any case. We know it intuitively. But while it might be common sense, it's not yet common practice across the sector, which is why it's worth spending some time on it, because these are some of the things that really do fall into that Pareto rule of relatively small things having a big impact. So just a few headlines then. And the first is from Dan Willingham's work and the importance of concepts. So we know more and remember more if we know and understand the concepts within the individual subjects. The reason these are so helpful for learning is they act as sort of holding baskets for a lot of information. If I understand a concept or a big idea, it means that new knowledge relating to that concept is going to be much stickier. So this is why it's really helpful for us to identify the concepts and the big ideas in the subjects that we're teaching. So the good news is there are plenty of them, but there aren't too many. So what we're going to do is select the ones that make most difference to our pupils and students' learning. So people sometimes ask, well, where do we find the concepts? Well, the place to find them are in the national curriculum documents as a starting point, and to focus on the purpose of education, the purpose of those subjects that's the first part of the national curriculum documents. So the tendency is to go straight into the detail of what needs to be taught, the programs of study, but actually it's worth paying attention to those first few paragraphs where it talks about what this subject is about. So in history, for example, you're going to find things like civilization and democracy. In geography, you're going to find things like migration. And just to make sure that we pay attention to those as we're planning a curriculum, because children knowing and understanding those and meeting them in lots of different units of their learning means that they're going to have a deeper and more secure understanding. So the identification of the concepts can really help us with sequencing as well. So this isn't sequencing lesson by lesson, it's sequencing of big ideas and building on prior knowledge. The further thing to say about the concepts is that they're generally tier 3 vocabulary, and they are the sort of gateways in to the jewels, the riches of the individual subjects. This is why it's so important to pay attention to them. Now, it so happens that a lot of these words, these concept words and big idea words, come from other languages, and a lot of them from Latin and Greek. So we've got an opportunity here to go into the roots of those words, the etymology of the words. This deepens children's learning, but also starts helping them to create a picture around those big ideas, a mental model around those big ideas. So I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just some examples of Tier 3 specialist vocabulary. I'm just going to pick up on isosceles, an isosceles triangle. Now, if we ask pupils or students what an isosceles triangle is, they can generally tell us. And that's because we're very good at teaching definitions. But we could take their learning deeper if we ask them to find out where the word isosceles comes from. It's very easy to do this. So we put the word into a browser, and then we use the plus symbol, and we put etymology, so we can show children how to do this, and it'll throw up where the word comes from. So once they've been shown how to do that, we can ask them to do some of this for homework, light touch research. But if we do that, we find out that the word isosceles comes from two Greek words. Isos is equal, and skeles is legs. So if I know that, it means I've got a bigger mental picture of what an isosceles triangle is. It's taking our learning deeper. Now, sometimes people say, well, this is a bit difficult. It's too hard for pupils and students to do this. Well, we've already established that pupils like doing difficult, demanding work. But in addition, we've got children in reception, some of whom are fluent in dinosaurs. They just know everything about dinosaurs. And some of those children also know that the word dinosaur comes from two Greek words. Dinos is scary, and sauros is lizard. So if they can do it at 4, they can cope. They could do it all the way through. Now, the schools that are experimenting with this are finding it's the children with the greatest language deficit that are making the greatest gains in their learning. And when they talk to the children about why they're getting on so well, they say things like, well, we like finding this stuff out. That's interesting because it's provoked their curiosity, and curiosity is a big driver for learning. Then they go on and say, it makes us feel clever. It makes us feel clever. And I think it's a great way to think about our teaching is to make our children, provide them with opportunities that make them feel clever. So for me, this is a classic 80-20 example for very little input from me as a teacher, apart from identifying these words, showing children how to do it, and then asking them to do it, for homework. It's taking their learning to a whole new level. And the point about the concepts, the big words, we need to be exposed to them, encounter them many times over before they become secure, and in lots of different contexts. And so this is a really rich, light touch way from me as a teacher, but really rich for children. And then what we might want to do is to pull together a knowledge organizer. This is just an example from a unit of work that I've prepared for Key Stage 2 on the first story of creation in the first book of Genesis. And I've just pulled out the big words that I want children to really be fluent in by the end of the unit. So this is the second place where we can find the concepts. The first is in the national curriculum documents, and then the second is in the material itself in high quality texts. So what might we find from Peter Brown and his colleagues' work in the science of successful learning, making it stick? An insight from them is that learning is likely to be deeper if we put some effort into it. Learning's likely to be deeper if we put some effort into it. So that's why this idea that we shouldn't shy away from making things too easy for our pupils and students, because we want the learning to be secure. Dan Willingham, human beings are curious. Actually, did we need the research to tell us this? We kind of know it, anyway, but useful lens through which to look at our curriculum in general and, what we're actually going to do in the classroom. Is what I'm offering my pupils and students, is it likely to provoke their curiosity? Because curiosity is a really important driver for learning. But then Dan goes on to say, but thinking is hard. Yes, but it's meant to be. And so that's why we don't leave children to struggle. That's why the thinking of high challenge and low threat is really, really important here. So what happens when we offer children some demanding texts? Well, a couple of examples here. This is from history, where a colleague has tested out the scholarship reading homework with a Year 7 guinea pig class and found that every student could access it, even those with a reading age below 10. Clearly, we need to have higher expectations of these pupils. So this is from Richard Kennett, brilliant historian and senior leader in Bristol. And the children have been learning about the Norman Conquest in their lessons. And this is what he's given them for homework. So instead of differentiated coloured worksheets and a dumbed down text, Richard has selected some extracts from Mark Morris's account of the Norman Conquest. And what he said to them is to read these extracts. So these extracts are from Mark Morris's book on the Norman Conquest, which is, Mark Morris is a world-renowned historian, so it's not dumbing down. What Richard says is, read these 2 pages and answer all the questions. This is supposed to be hard. So he's signalling the fact that this is going to stretch them, this high challenge. But then he goes on and says, if you can't answer all the questions, don't worry. So he's reassured them. And because of that, they've all had a go. They've all had a go. An example from Year 6, Ashley Booth's work. Why do I love whole class reading so much? Because a child who would have long been considered low ability in inverted commas can access text like The Caged Bird, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, along with their peers, and subsequently that great educational term, bang out stuff like this. So the child has clearly been supported. It's not that we withdraw support, but it's not been over scaffolded. And what the child is able to do is to make the connections between the bird in the cage in the novel, written in 1960, and the conditions for a large proportion of Black American society in the 1960s. So really moving material, and sadly still pertinent today. But the issue here is that child would not have been able to respond in that human way, but also in that intellectual way, if someone had decided that they couldn't cope. So this idea of thinking hard about challenge for all students, supporting them to get there through talk, is, I believe, one of the ways that we can really get back on track. Saves us time in preparation, but we're doing it because it's far more effective and deepening for children's learning. Now, did we need the cognitive science to tell us that our brains privilege story? We kind of know this intuitively, don't we? But we know more and remember more if we've heard it in a story. So when Willingham is talking about story, he's not just meaning novels and fairy tales. He's talking about any high quality text which has a narrative element to it. We've got this too from Steven Pinker, cognitive psychology, shown the mind best understands facts when they're woven into a conceptual fabric. We've already seen how important understanding concepts are, such as a narrative, a mental map or intuitive theory. Disconnected facts in the mind are like unlinked pages on the web. They might as well not exist. Have it too from Marianne Wolf, The Story in Science of the Reading Brain. Human beings invented reading only a few thousand years ago, and with this invention we rearranged the very organization of our brain, which in turn expanded the ways we were able to think, which altered the intellectual evolution of our species. And I take from this, in addition to what Marianne is saying, is that reading makes us cleverer as individuals. So this is a classic example of fewer things in greater depth. that selecting a high quality text provides children with the big picture. They contain a lot of the complex ideas and concepts. They enrich vocabulary, and they're inclusive for all our students and pupils. So, a few examples to remind ourselves that children enjoy doing demanding work, that when we're working up new units of work, we might consider underpinning them with high quality texts when we want children to know more and remember more. So just a few examples across primary and across secondary. If we're teaching, say, in year 6, the program of study where pupils need to be taught about the theory of evolution, we could base it on this lovely text by Sabina Radeva. It's going to provoke children's curiosity, those images. It's got that lovely subject-specific vocabulary, and it's going to do a lot of the heavy lifting, and some lovely examples too for misconceptions, which are springboards for new learning. In year 1, when children are being taught in history about the Great Fire of London, a lovely text here, the anniversary edition, sharing these beautiful images, maybe through a visualizer or an interactive whiteboard, and reading the story aloud several times to pupils while they are listening and taking in those lovely images. So a few more examples. Bill Bryson can support a lot both in science and design technology. This is wonderful for art and design. In primary, a history of pictures, just a wonderful book. Gombrich's Little History of the World. I've used this for year 8, but I've also had a colleague tell me that they've used it in year 5 as well. The great thing about high quality texts that are well written is that they can be used across ages and stages. Okay. People quite often say there are no stories in maths. I wouldn't be underpinning this in an actual planning for lessons, but what about asking children about where, for instance, 0 comes from? How many of our children know that? What about the Black American mathematicians who also happen to be female, who did all the work on the first mission to the moon? So these wider stories can be very productive, either for homework or in primary for topic. And here we've got an example of Alex Bellis's work. Very, very popular indeed. A good one for science in secondary. Feynman's Six Easy Pieces in Physics. Ben Rogers' work. So these are people, some of them working in school, pulling out the big ideas, and we've got them accessible to us in these lovely texts. Another one from Carlo Rovelli. Really well-written texts are accessible to everyone, even if they don't have a background in this example, science or physics. Lovely for RE, upper Key Stage 2 into Key Stage 3. Great for geography in Key Stage 3. Very helpful for Key Stage 4 as background to an inspector calls, what was happening in 1945 in Baruma's Year 0 work. For PSHE, citizenship, we could also get some geography from this. This is Amanda McWash's work. Where are you really from? So people who come from diverse backgrounds are quite often asked where they come from, and they might say Birmingham or Bristol, and then the follow-up question is, but where do you really come from? And it might not be intended to be hurtful, but if you're on the receiving end of that a lot, it is painful. So Amanda McWashi answers this question, so it opens up some really interesting conversations about all our backgrounds, and that's the starting point. Few examples to support geography. Actually, going back to one of the early learning goals in the early years, a lovely poem here could support some thinking about the understanding of the world. Great for Key Stage 1, The Street Beneath My Feet, Charlotte Willem and Yovel Sommer's work. The Pebble in My Pocket for Key Stage 2, could use this in geography or in science. So to pull these together, to do fewer things in greater depth, we might support it with Isabel Beck and her colleagues work bringing words to life, or we might include some of the strategies in Alex Quigley's Closing the Vocabulary Gap. So at the heart of this, we're asking ourselves, what is it that adds the greatest value to the curriculum for the pupils in our schools? Then we might ask ourselves the extent to which the worksheets that we offer our pupils are truly of great quality and supporting children's learning. And what we could do is, if we are teaching about the interior of a place of worship, that we include materials that are authentic, that come from those places, those honest places, rather than worksheets. So here we've got an example from the Khan Academy, some examples from the Museum with No Frontiers, where we show children, if we're teaching them about Islam in RE, the authentic sources as opposed to poor quality worksheets that are sometimes downloaded from the internet. For me, this is a big element of Back on Track, that we have a hard think about the quality of what's offered and to go back to original sources. Now, just a few examples from history. These are from the British Museum. These are going to provoke children's curiosity. They're going to be strong drivers for learning. And so these are all freely available from the British Museum Teaching History with 100 Objects program. So if we're teaching, for instance, about ancient Greece, either in history or in English, if we're teaching about ancient myths, Greek myths, and we're teaching the myth of Demeter and Persephone, we could draw on these wonderful resources from the British Museum of the artifacts and the art from the ancient world. So this idea that part of getting back on track is making sure that we're taking care to produce really, really high quality resources to offer to our children. And what I'm arguing is that we go to resources that have been carefully prepared by the academics, the specialists in the field, working alongside teachers. So a big thread of provision for children is thinking about, is this coming from authentic source, or is it a poor quality worksheet which has been downloaded from the internet? So we might ask ourselves, well, where do we go to find the authentic sources? So for each of the national curriculum subjects, I've done some quick overviews on the online platform Myatt and Co, where I've pulled out those purpose statements, the important statements that I was referring to earlier, and then provided half a dozen high quality links to websites that we know are going to be authentic and take them as close as possible, our pupils, to the origins. And I shall put a link to that in the notes. It's also worth drawing on the subject associations for each subject. Again, I've included those in the quick overviews. So just to wrap this up in terms of getting back on track and what we might cut back on, marking is obviously one of them. So here we have Dylan William saying that it's a pretty expensive way of spending our time. Now, it's not that we don't look at children's books. It's important to have a sense of what they're doing, but pulling together those key things that we want to start the lesson with or include in the following lesson on a whole class feedback sheet, which is going to be far more efficient, better for children's learning, is a classic example of the 80-20 rule. A relatively small strategy having a big impact on children's learning and also saving us time. We also need to be rethinking how we understand progress, that it's the curriculum itself that's the progression model. And so how do we gather evidence for whether our children have learnt what we've taught them? Well, we have a look at their work, we hear what they've got to say, and then what we observe that they can do on their own terms. So Tim Oates has got a very useful insight here where he talks about, because he led on the review of the national curriculum. He says we've got some insights as to whether our children have learnt what we intended through the things that they produce, the products of children's learning. So what might they produce? Well, we can see it in the work themselves. An example from Austin's Butterfly, you can see the progress the child has made as they develop towards producing an accurate drawing of the swallow-tailed butterfly. Okay, it doesn't need numbers, it doesn't need sub-levels, it's evident in the work. We might also do some comparative judgment work, Daisy Christodoulou's and Chris Whedon's work, and possibly some standardized assessments can be helpful as well. I think another area that moves us away from poor quality worksheets, which if you talk to children about, they quite often can't remember or talk about it, are to draw on double page spreads. So these are examples from Paul Watson's school at the North Ormsby Academy, where children have synthesized their learning and generated new insights over time, and then they draw it together in these double page spreads, which, as you can see, are really high quality, real evidence of children's learning. So a reminder that the curriculum is the progression model, and to continue to ask ourselves, what is it that adds the greatest value, to stop trying to do everything, and to recognize that there will be trade-offs if we make some things a priority and not others. And that's why we really need to be thinking hard about what it is that provides the greatest impact for the lowest amount of input as we get back on track. So reminding ourselves this is about the disciplined pursuit of less, thinking about how we use our meetings when we are in normal times. They've had to be operational during lockdown, but could some of those meetings be used to read books, share books, talk about what it is we're planning to do in the curriculum, finding great resources, etc. So I hope that's helpful as we get back on track for the development of an ambitious curriculum.